What if the birth of a nation could trigger a war within hours? What if the fate of millions was decided not by peace treaties, but by a single declaration spoken on a single night? And what if two peoples, both convinced this land was theirs, collided at the very moment the world looked away? In the aftermath of World War II, the Middle East stood on a knife's edge. The British Empire, exhausted and broken, was preparing to abandon its mandate in Palestine, leaving behind a powder keg of rival promises and shattered trust. Jewish survivors of genocide demanded a homeland. Palestinian Arabs vowed to defend their own. Every village became a fortress. Every road became a front line. Then, on May 14th, 1948, 8 hours before the British flag was lowered for the last time, David Ben-Gurion stepped up to a microphone and declared the creation of the State of Israel. Cheers erupted from his followers, but across the Arab world, armies were already mobilizing. At midnight, as the ink on Israel's declaration was still drying, soldiers from 5 nations surged across the borders. The first Arab-Israeli war had begun, and nobody knew which side would survive the dawn. But before we dive into this brutal struggle, a quick message from our sponsor, World of Tanks, the tactical armored warfare game featuring hundreds of historically accurate mid-20th century vehicles. Use the link below to support the channel and join millions of players mastering iconic tanks on the battlefield. The war for a homeland, the war for survival, the war that reshaped the entire Middle East. This is the story of 1948, the moment history changed forever. Prelude to war. The roots of this war stretch back far before 1948. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, Britain took control of Palestine and made promises it was never able or willing to keep. To Jewish communities seeking a homeland after centuries of persecution, the British pledged support for a national home. Yet to the Arab population already living there for generations, Britain promised independence. 2 nations, 2 dreams, and only one land. As more Jewish immigrants arrived in the 1920s and 30s, escaping rising anti-Semitism in Europe, tensions turned violent. Each attack fueled retaliations. Each retaliation deepened the divide. By the end of World War II, Palestine was a battlefield, one that Britain could no longer control. Then came a decision that changed everything. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted to split the land into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab. Celebrations erupted in Jewish streets. But to Palestinian Arabs and the surrounding Arab world, the decision felt like a theft of their homeland, a decision made without them, against them, on their own soil. They rejected the plan, and diplomacy collapsed overnight. The conflict exploded into a full-scale civil war. Buses were ambushed, neighborhoods barricaded, and supply routes cut. Villages that had once traded and lived side by side now exchanged gunfire. The powerful Jewish Haganah fought desperately to secure key roads and cities, while Palestinian Arab fighters, including the loosely coordinated Arab Liberation Army, struck at isolated settlements and convoys. The British, eager to leave, stood by and watched the chaos unfold, intervening only when their own troops were threatened. As the violence intensified, fear spread faster than armies. Tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians fled their homes, some driven out by battle, others escaping the terror they knew was coming. Refugee columns stretched toward Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, carrying stories of loss that enraged the Arab world. People demanded action, leaders promised intervention, and every day the countdown continued toward the inevitable moment when Britain would finally depart. and the final confrontation would ignite, because soon there would be no empire left to hold the line. Only two peoples, two armies, and one land. Neither was willing to surrender. The birth of Israel and the Arab invasion. On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, in a modest hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion rose to his feet and read a declaration that would change the world, the birth of the State of Israel. As the final words echoed, the room erupted in celebration, people cheering and hugging, believing that at last, after 2,000 years of exile and persecution, a Jewish homeland was reborn. But even as flags were lifted and tears streamed down faces, warplanes were already warming their engines on nearby runways. Across the borders, Arab leaders listened to the same announcement and heard only a provocation. Hours later, before Israel had even fully formed a government, before its people had time to process the moment, 5 Arab armies launched a coordinated invasion. From the south, Egyptian tanks crossed the Sinai dunes. From the east, the battle-hardened Arab Legion of Jordan marched toward Jerusalem. Syrian forces advanced from the Golan Heights, Iraqi units pushed in from the Jordan Valley, and Lebanese troops struck the northern frontier. Maps of the region lit up like a storm, arrows converging on a tiny newborn state that seemed impossibly outnumbered. For decades, a dramatic slogan would echo in history books: one Jewish state against 7 Arab nations. But the truth was more complex, and perhaps even more frightening. Israel had nearly 30,000 fighters ready, Haganah veterans who had mobilized every able body. The Arab forces combined numbered around 23,000 on the invading fronts. The Egyptians were the strongest, with dozens of tanks, artillery, and battlefield experience, while Jordan's Arab Legion had British training and discipline unmatched in the region. Meanwhile, Israel entered this war with almost no heavy weapons and only 3 functional Sherman tanks. 3 against tanks, warplanes, artillery, and multiple national armies. The myth suggests Israel faced an overwhelming giant. The reality is more haunting. Both sides were terrified they could be destroyed. Israel feared annihilation before its first sunrise. The Arab states feared allowing a Jewish state to take root. On both sides, leaders told their soldiers the same thing: this battle decides everything. So as the sun set on Israel's first day of existence, the explosions began. Air raid sirens screamed across Tel Aviv. Civilians rushed into shelters. Soldiers grabbed weapons that had no replacement if lost. The war for independence, the war for Palestine, the war for the future of the Middle East had begun, with no guarantee that Israel would live long enough to see its second dawn. Southern Front, Egypt advances. Egypt launched the main invasion from the south, their tanks and armored cars rolling across the Sinai Desert, aiming straight for Tel Aviv. On paper, this should have been a swift victory, but the first obstacles they met were not armies. They were small farming settlements. Places like Kfar Darom and Hiram had only a few dozen defenders, teenagers, farmers, and volunteers, armed with rifles, homemade explosives, and a single Piat anti-tank weapon. When Egyptian armor approached, the defenders ambushed them at close range, hitting tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails. What should have fallen in minutes somehow held out for hours, and then days. The biggest shock came at Yad Mordechai, a kibbutz sitting on high ground that controlled the main coastal road north. Egypt attacked with tanks, artillery, and hundreds of soldiers. Yet a small group of Israelis, dug into trenches and bunkers, refused to break. They knocked out vehicles, inflicted casualties, and forced Egypt to regroup again and again. After 5 brutal days, the defenders finally withdrew, but the psychological damage to the Egyptian command was done. Israel was not collapsing. It was fighting back. Then came the turning point at Asdod. Egypt halted there to prepare for the final advance on Tel Aviv, only 30 kilometers away. But at sunset, on May 29th, the unexpected happened. 4 clumsy Israeli fighter planes, Avia S-199s, recently smuggled in from Czechoslovakia, swooped down and launched the first Israeli airstrike in history. The attack wasn't militarily impressive, but it shattered the illusion that Egypt controlled the skies. Panic spread. Egyptian commanders radioed Cairo that they could not safely advance anymore. The offensive stalled. Tel Aviv braced for tanks, but none arrived. A nation that was supposed to be erased in days was still standing, and with every passing moment, Israel was gaining strength. Central Front, the battle for Jerusalem. Jerusalem instantly became the most emotional front of the war. Both sides saw it not just as a city, but as a symbol. When the British left, Jordan's elite Arab Legion seized the key fortress at Latrun, the choke point on the only road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. With that move, the Jewish districts inside the city were cut off and placed under siege. Supplies dwindled, and every convoy trying to reach the city turned into a deadly gamble. Battles erupted across holy ground. Near the Notre Dame building, Israeli fighters traded fire with Legion snipers only meters from sacred sites. At Ramat Rachel to the south, Egyptian-backed forces pushed hard, capturing the kibbutz, only for Israeli troops to counterattack and retake it in fierce close combat. Inside the walls of the old city, the situation became hopeless. The Jewish quarter was shelled relentlessly, homes collapsed, food ran out, and wounded fighters lay untreated. On May 28th, its defenders surrendered. Civilians were forced out, while the remaining Israeli fighters were taken prisoner. But the Arab Legion ensured their safety, pushing back locals who searched for revenge. Even in war, flashes of humanity survived. Israel could not break through Latrun, despite launching several assaults, many carried out by barely trained new recruits who were thrown into battle with little preparation. Each failed attack meant more lives lost and no progress gained. So instead, Israeli engineers took a different path, literally. Working night after night, they carved a rough supply route through the steep Judean hills, beyond Arab Legion view. Trucks struggled up the climbs, engines screaming, but eventually they reached the city. This improvised lifeline was named the Burma Road, and it saved Jerusalem from starvation. Jerusalem hadn't been lost, but neither had it been won. The ancient city was now split in two, its future uncertain as the war raged on around it. Northern Front, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. While Egypt and Jordan fought in the south and center, the Northern Front erupted into chaos. Iraqi forces crossed into Palestine with confidence, advancing toward the strategic town of Jenin. Their goal was simple but devastating: break through to the Mediterranean and cut Israel in half. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed, but Israeli resistance stiffened. Fierce battles raged in hills and narrow valleys, and Iraqi attacks stalled. When Israel counterattacked and briefly captured Jenin, the Iraqis panicked and fell back. They eventually retook the town, but by then, their spirit to push farther was already broken. To the northeast, Syrian troops crossed the border near the Sea of Galilee. They advanced with tanks and artillery, trying to overrun the tiny kibbutzim guarding the shoreline. But at Degania, Israel's very first kibbutz, Syrian armor was stopped cold. Molotovs, anti-tank guns, and sheer desperation destroyed their lead tanks. Shocked and bleeding, the Syrians retreated into the hills, abandoning their attempt to reach the heart of the Jewish state. Farther west, the Lebanese army also entered the fight, capturing the border village of Malkiya only to lose it to Israeli forces, regain it, and lose it again. A constant tug-of-war over a single strategic point showed just how chaotic and indecisive this front had become. In the north, the Arab armies were larger and better equipped, but they were fighting on unfamiliar terrain against defenders who knew every hill, every ravine, every stone wall. What was supposed to be a coordinated assault turned into isolated pushes that failed to support each other. Israel remained bruised but unbroken. The northern threat had been contained, and Israel now had the breathing room it desperately needed to prepare for the next phase of the war. UN truce and transformation of war. After weeks of non-stop fighting, the United Nations stepped in and called for a truce on June 11th. On the surface, it looked like a much-needed pause, a chance to bury the dead and treat the wounded. But behind the scenes, both sides treated the ceasefire as a race, because when the guns would start again, whoever was stronger would control the war's future. For the Arab armies, the truce was a moment to reorganize. They replaced lost equipment and reinforced key positions. But Israel used the ceasefire for something far bigger: survival through transformation. Before the war, the Haganah was a scattered underground militia. During the truce, it became a true national army, the Israel Defense Forces. Almost overnight, its manpower doubled as thousands of immigrants, volunteers, and reservists joined the fight. Young men and women who had never fired a gun were trained intensely, often right on the front lines. And then came the shipments that changed everything. Smuggled deals with Czechoslovakia brought in what Israel needed most: modern weapons, 25,000 rifles, 5,000 machine guns, 50 million rounds of ammunition, mortars, artillery, armored vehicles, and tanks. Suddenly, the IDF wasn't just holding the line, it was preparing to break it. A British official watching from the sidelines summed it up perfectly. The Arabs lost the initiative during the 4 weeks, and the Jews were able to re-equip themselves. By the end of the truce, the army that had begun this war with barely any heavy weapons now had the power to strike back. The newborn state, which many thought would collapse in days, was gearing up to launch its own offensives. The pause was over. The next round would decide who truly had the upper hand. Israel strikes back, and the war's final shape is drawn. With new weapons, new soldiers, and new confidence, Israel took the offensive. The first major strike was called Operation Danny, a sweeping attack aimed at the central front. Israeli forces advanced on the critical towns of Lydda and Ramleh, areas dominating the main road to Jerusalem. In intense urban fighting, both cities were captured. More territory came under Israel's control, and pressure on Jerusalem eased. Meanwhile, in the north, Operation Dekel shattered remaining Arab positions in the Lower Galilee. Town after town fell as Israeli troops pushed toward Nazareth, securing a region that had been heavily contested since the beginning of the war. For the first time, Arab armies were being driven backward, not forward, but the decisive showdown was still to come in the south. Operation Yoav began with airstrikes, hammering Egyptian positions stretching from Gaza to the Judean foothills. The Egyptian line, once seen as immovable, suddenly cracked. Beersheba, the capital of the Negev, fell to Israeli troops after fierce fighting. One Egyptian brigade was cut off entirely, trapped in what became known as the Fallujah Pocket. While these soldiers held out stubbornly, their isolation hinted at the collapse of Egypt's campaign. At sea, the Israelis launched a daring nighttime commando attack. Explosive-packed boats rammed and sank the Egyptian flagship, the Emir Farouk, near the coast, a psychological and strategic blow that forced Egyptian naval assets back. Then came Operation Hiram in the north. In just a few days of rapid maneuver, Israeli brigades overran Arab Liberation Army strongholds in Upper Galilee and pushed several miles into Lebanon, capturing high ground and border villages. Arab defenses crumbled, and the road to complete northern control opened. The final push was Operation Horev, Israel's bold plan to drive the Egyptians entirely out of Palestine. Armored columns surged through the Negev and into the Sinai Desert, cutting supply routes and forcing Egyptian troops to retreat westward. Victory seemed within reach. But when Israeli forces advanced too deep into Sinai territory, Britain threatened intervention. Israel halted its advance, yet its strategic goal had already been achieved. Egypt's army was beaten, cornered in the Gaza Strip. Realizing the war had turned against them, Arab governments agreed to negotiations. Over several months, armistice agreements took shape. Egypt would keep the Gaza Strip. Jordan retained the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City. Lebanon returned to its internationally recognized border. Syria, after delays and internal political struggles, signed last. The guns finally fell silent. The map was redrawn. The war was over, for now. Israel celebrated survival and stunning territorial gains, but the Arab nations mourned a defeat they could not accept. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees remained displaced. Jerusalem stood divided by barbed wire and barricades, and bitterness on both sides guaranteed that this would not be the final chapter. The First Arab-Israeli War ended without peace, and the seeds of many future wars had already taken root.